Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Lisa Servan. I'm Dean of Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy. And this is the 14th time we have hosted the Nathan W. Levin Lecture on Public Policy, which was endowed in 1989 in honor of an extremely important New School community member. Professionally, Nathan Levin was an industrialist and a financier. We know him as someone who was involved with the New School for more than 40 years as one of our trustees. Early in his career, he worked closely with Julius Rosenwald, the longtime president of the Sears Roebuck Corporation. And the two of them together provided seed money for the construction of thousands of schools for African American students in an effort to counter the devastating impact of racial segregation in the South. Later, Nathan Levin became president of the Reporter magazine and chairman of Pantheon Books. In addition to the New School, he served on the board of directors of the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Hall of Science, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and Scientific American magazine. He was also president and treasurer of his own investment firm. Nathan Levin joined the New School's Board of Trustees in 1942, and he served until his death in 1988 at the age of 84. He was chairman of the Board of Trustees at this university from 1961 to 1963, and he served as president of the university for the academic year 1960 and 1961. So it's an understatement to say that he was intimately involved with this university and bringing it to the place that we are now. Nathan Levin was in a small circle of a number of civic leaders affiliated with the New School at the time who promoted reform politics and community service. And that's so much a part of what we do now at the New School. The vision of that small circle of people ultimately led to the founding of the Center for New York City Affairs in the early 1960s. The center was a forerunner of what is now Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy. And Milano, in turn, in many ways exemplifies Nathan Levin's vision and his commitment to racial equity and economic justice. The Center for New York City Affairs at Milano organized tonight's event as part of its larger mission to promote policy innovations that strengthen neighborhoods, support families, and reduce poverty. The center focuses on issues of public education, child and family services, immigrants, urban politics, and strategies for building stronger communities. Milano shares that mission. Our school is dedicated to training the current and next generation of leaders in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and to fostering thriving cities and neighborhoods. A Milano education, as those of you who I see in the audience who are students know, does not just happen in the classroom. Our students take on real-life problems for real clients across the sectors and solve them. So this school is as much about learning from experience as it is learning from books and in the classroom. At Milano, we teach the skills that lie at the intersection of policy and implementation, and the skills managers need to improve their organizations and better serve communities in need. The combination of policy and management that lies at the heart of the Milano education prepares our alumni to be effective in all three sectors. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to welcome and acknowledge a few friends who are with us in the audience tonight. First, I want to welcome Gail Freeman, Jeff Hodgman, Emily Youssef, and Steve Nislik, all of whom are members of the Milano Board of Governors. Gail and Emily are alumni as well, and Emily is the new chair of our Dean's Alumni Council. I also want to welcome Tony Manarino, a member of our Dean's Alumni Council, and soon, I hope, a member of our board as well. Next, I'd like to say hello to Sam Marks of the Deutsche Bank Foundation, which is a strong supporter of the Center for New York City Affairs. And finally, I want to welcome our next speaker, Larry Parks, and his colleague, Tim Simons. Both are with the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, which has provided additional support for this program. So I first met Larry Parks about a year ago when I became Dean of Milano. And Larry has been serving on the Milano Board of Governors for about 5 years. And as I've gotten to know him over the past years, he's been wonderfully engaged and supportive of both me and the mission of the school. He's lent his time, his intellect, his energy, and resources to Milano quite generously. He has a deep and organic understanding of cities, of finance, of politics, and of social and economic justice issues, which is why he is a perfect fit as a governor for the board. His biography is in your program. Last year, Larry helped me bring Angela Blackwell of PolicyLink to Milano as the Levin Lecturer. And this year in May, when Larry and I were talking in my office, He raised the idea of holding a program at Milano to debunk myths about the role of minorities in the Community Reinvestment Act in the global economic meltdown, and to look at the role of consumers in the financial landscape that's being reshaped by this recession. So my hope is that tonight we'll gain a deeper understanding of these issues and maybe even find some answers. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Larry to the podium. Please give a round of applause to him and to all of Milano's supporters who are here with us tonight.
Yeah, that was really nice of you, Lisa. I didn't know you thought that of me. I have the pleasure tonight of being really brief, but introducing your keynote for tonight. So I stand between you and her. What I can say, I mean, off the cuff and on the cuff, the highest compliment that was given to me 2 weeks ago when Congresswoman Waters called me one of her advisors. Because to be an advisor to Maxine Waters is a true pleasure. No one has stood more steadfastly for both social justice, economic justice, and inclusion than Congresswoman Waters. And what that has meant over her entire political career, both in the Congress and in the state legislature in California, has been really simply, sometimes you have to take on powerful interests, you have to speak truth to power, and you have to force the interests that you care about more than fearing the consequences. Sometimes that means you're on the outside of the media, sometimes that means you're on the outside of the Democratic Party. Sometimes that means you're an outcast to lots and lots and lots of powerful interests. But if you're on the side of fairness, justice, and equity, you have to be willing to take on those fights. And I know that Milano stands for creating leaders who believe in that. So I just think it's a perfect marriage by having her here and having those interests brought up. In the subprime crisis that you're going to hear about tonight, nobody has stood out more in this area for dealing with the disparity issues, for dealing with the future, and what the future looks like than Congresswoman Waters. One of the things that she's done that most people don't know is that when you deal with loan modifications, she came up with a program to put $4 billion in the CDBG last year in the middle of the meltdown in July. People thought she was crazy, as she's often called. And she said that it's not going to happen, and you're not going to have this money, and we don't have the money, and we're broke, and all this kind of stuff. Well, she used the political process to make sure that Congressman Frank knew that that was something he couldn't barter away. And she knew how to build the kind of coalitions, which she's been doing legendarily in her entire career, to make sure that that was a reality. So the loan modification money that exists, scant though it may be, is totally responsible. That's the money that she put in CDBG for today to basically help write down loan modification. She's done this throughout her career. I mean, if you know what she's done in 1992 after the LA riots, she's built institutions in Los Angeles, from Community Bill that deals with job training, to so many other institutions that exist now, because she saw the opportunity that existed in the riots to basically tell the story of urban America, to tell the story of those who were left out and dispossessed, and to say that times have to change or this will continue. So she uses every opportunity to set the course, set the agenda. You know, now as chair of the housing subcommittee in the Congress, I mean, once again, she's in the position of basically being in the middle of the storm, being able to define how success will be measured. We did a forum that she had me do at the Congressional Black Caucus 2 weeks ago, where she challenged the regulators who kept saying, we're doing things for minority inclusion, and she says, where's the result? And they sat there and they kind of said, well, I guess we got to get back to you. And she's like, yeah, you better believe it. Because she knows how to challenge, tell truth to power, not be fearful of it, make a difference, and realize that oftentimes that means you make long-term friends, not just short-term acquaintances. And with that, I welcome you and look forward to the evening with Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today to participate in this series of public policy forums. But before I begin my remarks, there are several people I'd like to thank. First, I'd like to thank Larry Parks and Tim Silent. I didn't realize that he considered it a very special honor to be called my advisor. But I want him to know that when he and Tim spend time in my office, I learn more about what is happening in many of our financial institutions than all of the time that I spend in hearings. And when they come, it's not as if they have an appointment where they're going to spend a half hour. Sometimes we're able to chat for long periods of time, and we can talk in ways that we can't talk in public hearings. We can talk about people. We can do an assessment on who tells the truth and who does not. And we can talk about the history of some of these institutions. And the wonderful thing about Larry is he brings this background of experience and involvement that I find so helpful. We have a lot of very, very bright young people in my office, but they don't have any historical perspective. And so I'm very appreciative for him and for Tim. And I thank you very much, and give them a round of applause. I would also like to thank the Center for New York City Affairs, and of course the Milano School for Management and Urban Policy, and for the Board of Governors and the Alumni Council, all for inviting me here to take part in this very, very timely and important subject. Today, I'm going to share my views on race and the subprime crisis, the future of minority neighborhoods. I'm going to take you through a brief history of the subprime meltdown, the impact that it's having on minority neighborhoods, and what Congress and the Obama administration have done and should do now to respond to this crisis. And I will end by discussing what resources and programs minority neighborhoods need to secure our future viability. The subprime mortgage crisis, the genesis and impact on the economy. We're here today facing the worst foreclosure epidemic since the Great Depression for a variety of reasons. First of all, more Americans became homeowners during the past decade, and many of them were especially vulnerable to foreclosures. Now, I'm going to make a statement that sounds as if I'm paying a compliment to someone who should not be complimented, and I'm going to try and clear it up. The Bush administration slashed the budget for rental assistance programs and instead embraced home ownership as its primary wealth creation and housing program. I want to go back to when I first entered the California State Legislature in California, and the realization that minority communities were redlined. Literally, lines were drawn around minority neighborhoods, and banks did not invest, they did not give mortgages, they simply wrote off entire communities. And so I was involved for the entire time that I was in the California State Legislature in fighting against redlining. In that fight and in that struggle that so many people were involved in across this nation, we helped to strengthen CRA, and we helped to open up the discussion about the need to include minorities in these opportunities. Well, what's interesting about all of this is when the subprime era came into being, many of us saw it as predatory lending, but eventually they made a good case for saying, listen, we can go into neighborhoods where we think people need a little bit of extra help, where perhaps the credit ratings are not as good, where people don't have as much as they need in down payments, et cetera, but we've got to limit the risk. And so subprime lending was described as a way, perhaps where you charge a little bit more in interest, and supposedly when people showed that they could benefit and they could repay their loans, they would reduce the interest rates to accommodate people who had shown that they could certainly take care of these mortgages. Well, what I think is, without the empirical data that perhaps someone will present at some point in time in our history, I think when they came into these communities with the subprime loans, they realized that there was gold in them their hills. And so not only did we have the predatory lending, the subprime loans, but then people figured out how to package them, how to securitize them, how to get them invested in, and how Wall Street could get involved in this, and that leads us into the discussion that I think we can have this evening. While the administration slashed the budget for rental assistance programs, it focused on home ownership programs in this environment that I'm alluding to. The results were that from 2001 to 2005, home ownership rates increased from 67.1% to 69.2%, the highest level in recorded history. However, federal home ownership programs weren't entirely responsible for this increase in home ownership levels. Lax lending standards coupled with the securitization of mortgages played a significant role. Because mortgages were bundled into securities and sold off to unsuspecting investors in many cases, lenders weren't necessarily accountable for whether or not the loans they were originating were good for borrowers and sustainable over the long term. As a result, lenders had every incentive to write unsustainable loans, and they did just that. The bundling of mortgages into securities was not new, but it accelerated at the beginning of this decade. From 2001 to 2005, at the height of the subprime bubble, the amount of mortgage-backed securities increased from $1.344 trillion to $2.111 trillion. While investors bought and sold these mortgages, Wall Street investment houses like Goldman Sachs made billions through the bundling and securitization of these loans, with little thought to whether or not the loans were good or bad. Securitization of mortgages made them easier to obtain, leading to more home buyers, including speculators, entering the market. With more people buying homes and mortgages readily available, home prices began increasing at exponential rates. For example, from 2000 to 2006, the average home price of new homes increased from $207,000 to $305,900. The increase in home prices drove more home buyers into the market. They wanted to buy because they saw prices rising and they thought they would be left out. They wanted to buy because suddenly home ownership was a very profitable way for the average person who might not have enough savvy to play the stock market or might not have a job that allows for retirement savings to begin to create some wealth. And they wanted to buy because due to a proliferation of exotic mortgage products in some parts of the country, it was actually cheaper to pay a monthly mortgage than to rent an apartment. What they didn't know was that these products were highly risky and in some cases were designed to strip out home equity. These mortgages contained terms that at first glance appeared to result in low payments. For example, during the subprime bubble, we saw a proliferation of adjustable rate mortgages, ARMs as they are referred to. These loans started out with a teaser rate, an artificially low interest rate that sometimes lasted for 2 or 3 years. Many homeowners qualified for their mortgage payments based on these rates, which resulted in ultra-low mortgage payments. However, after the teaser rate expired, the loan's interest was then subject to prevailing interest rates, which began rising several years ago. Suddenly, these so-called affordable loans became highly unaffordable. The Federal Reserve's intervention in decreasing interest rates has helped homeowners in these kinds of loans. If the Federal Reserve allows interest rates to rise, many homeowners with these loans will have trouble paying their mortgages. Payment option adjustable rate mortgages are similar to ARMs, but much more insidious. These are loans where the borrower can pick a payment. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because Wachovia, which used to be one of our largest banks, developed a loan product called Pick a Payment. The payment is either an amount that doesn't cover interest, an amount that only covers interest, or an amount that covers interest and principal. If the borrower pays less than interest, the difference is tacked on to the principal. This means that with each payment, the principal balance increases instead of decreasing. This negative amortization results in loans that are instantly underwater. That is, the borrower owes more than the home is worth. According to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, there are about 900,000 of these loans out there, with the majority concentrated in my home state of California. Only 70% of these loans are current and performing. And for your information, Wachovia's pick-a-payment business line was directly responsible for its downfall. The bank has since been absorbed by Wells Fargo. What was even worse than these mortgage products was the fact that many of these loans had prepayment penalties. This meant that in the event a borrower realized that they had a bad loan or needed to refinance or sell, they had to pay sometimes as much as 5% of the loan amount just to get out of the loan. In addition to these mortgage products, there were also the no-doc loans, which we call stated income loans or liar loans. These loans were initially designed for the self-employed people who don't have pay stubs or other traditional documentation of income. Instead, mortgage brokers were happy to process loans without verifying the borrower's income, or they simply filled it in. In the course of my work helping homeowners who are struggling with these mortgages, I've heard from countless homeowners who have told me that they said their income was one amount, but the broker wrote in substantially higher amounts, simply to qualify them for what would be an unaffordable loan. Speaking of mortgage brokers, you may be wondering why they would deliberately qualify someone for a loan they knew they couldn't afford. The compensation of most brokers was based on something called a yield spread premium. This is essentially a kickback to the mortgage broker. This compensation structure resulted in brokers providing borrowers with loans that were in the best interest of the broker, not the borrower. Instead of making sure that borrowers received good loans, brokers had every incentive to provide borrowers with costly loans, because the more costly the loan, the more compensation the broker received. Rising home prices, exotic mortgage products, mortgage securitization, and broker compensation all combined to form a perfect storm for the greatest housing bubble in our nation's history. The percentage of subprime loans skyrocketed from 5% of the mortgage market in 1994 to 20% of the market in 2005. Home ownership rates rose, and if home prices had continued to rise, everything would have been fine. But all bubbles eventually burst. And when this bubble burst, the impact was felt by minorities in particular. Rising interest rates and home price declines were our first indications that the bubble had burst. Home prices have fallen 16% from this time in 2008, while home sales briefly rebounded. They are down 2.7% this month. Rising interest rates meant that those ARMs that seemed such a bargain at origination were now unaffordable. Home price declines meant that homeowners with ARMs didn't have enough equity to refinance to a better loan. Homeowners began defaulting on their loans, and those defaults were certainly felt on Wall Street. Those securitized mortgages, which once had seemed like such a good investment, were now both toxic and worthless. The financial markets collapsed under the weight of these toxic assets. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. AIG received over $170 billion in federal dollars. Countrywide, which was really the poster boy, was purchased by Bank of America, the poster child, if you could imagine, for the subprime lending. They were purchased by Bank of America, and most of the major banks received hundreds of billions in bailout money from America's taxpayers. The mortgage servicers who profited from these loans were suddenly reluctant to modify them so that the homeowners could stay in their homes and avoid foreclosure. It was more profitable for the servicer of the loan to go into foreclosure, which allows the servicer to collect fees and other income than to modify the loan for free. A wave of foreclosures began in areas like Cleveland, Ohio, as well as booming Sunbelt communities like Las Vegas, Nevada, Orlando, Florida, and is now affecting every state in the nation. The statistics on foreclosures are sobering. The Center for Responsible Lending estimates that there are 6,500 foreclosures every day, and that there will be 2.4 million foreclosure starts in 2009. According to data from RealtyTrack, there have been foreclosure filings on over 1.5 million properties in the first half of 2009, a 9% increase from the last half of 2008, and a 15% increase from the first half of 2008. Even more foreclosures are anticipated as the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency estimates that 11.4% of homeowners with a mortgage are behind on their payments or in foreclosure. This is a record high. The collapse of the financial and housing markets has had a marked impact on the economy. Unemployment is currently at 9.8% nationally, and is considerably higher among African Americans and Latinos. The economy is shedding jobs, with an average of 691,000 jobs lost a month in the first quarter of 2009 and 400,000 a month lost in the second quarter. The economy is still shrinking. While gross domestic product fell at an average rate of 6.4% in the first quarter of 2009, the fastest rate of decline since 1958, the decrease slowed to 1% in the second quarter of 2009. Americans stand to lose $352 billion in equity from their homes. 1 in 4 homeowners now owe more on their homes than they are worth. Americans have also lost retirement savings and other investments. Last year, $7 trillion in wealth was lost from the stock markets. Let's talk about minorities and the subprime meltdown and the impacts on homeownership, wealth creation, and communities. Homeownership has long been the American dream. As we have seen, a few unscrupulous actors made billions through policies and programs that transform those dreams into a nightmare. What typically isn't mentioned when policymakers talk about subprime meltdown, which I've just described, is that this crisis is heavily concentrated among people of color. The subprime meltdown is really a meltdown of minority homeownership, minority wealth, and minority communities. When we talk about targeting and disproportionate impacts on minorities, in some circles, there's a propensity to dismiss these claims. After all, minorities and non-minorities are supposed to have access to the same mortgage brokers, the same loan products, and the same homes. As a result, some make the argument that it's impossible for minorities to have been specifically targeted for subprime loans. However, numerous studies and substantial data support the assertion that targeting certainly did take place and that minorities were the main recipients of these products. Indeed, the targeting of these mortgage products to minorities was so egregious that subprime loans could not have flourished without minorities. A 2004 study that looked at a national sample of 50,000 subprime loans found that when African American and Latino borrowers were compared to white borrowers with the same characteristics, African Americans and Latinos were more likely to receive loans with much higher interest rates. A 2005 study by the Center for Responsible Lending found that borrowers in areas with high concentrations of minorities were 30% more likely to receive loans with prepayment penalties. A 2006 study of Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, that is HMDA, data by the Federal Reserve found that in 2005, 52% of loans made to African Americans and 40% of loans made to Latinos were subprime. In comparison, only 19% of loans made to white borrowers were subprime. A 2007 study by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies found that 46% of Hispanics and 55% of African Americans who received mortgages in 2005 received subprime mortgages. This is in comparison to 17% of whites. Even among higher income minority groups, the pattern holds. In Boston, for example, the same study found that 73% of high-income African-American home buyers and 70% of high-income Hispanic home buyers received subprime loans in 2005 in comparison to 17% of high-income white home buyers. A 2007 study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that middle and upper income African Americans were twice as likely to receive higher interest rates than whites with similar incomes. As a result of yield spread premiums, African Americans and Latinos also paid more for their loans. In 2007, Harvard law professor Howell Jackson found that because of yield spread premiums, African Americans paid an average additional upfront charge of $474 per loan, while Latinos an average of an additional $580 per loan. Home ownership among African Americans and Latinos increased because of subprime loans. According to the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, these groups accounted for 49% of the increase in homeowners from 1995 to 2005. However, the same products that made homeownership possible have also erased those gains. At the end of 2006, 48.2% of African Americans and 49.5% of Latinos owned their own homes. Less than 3 years later, in 2009, 46.5% of African Americans and 48.1% of Latinos are homeowners. As I mentioned earlier, servicers have been reluctant to modify loans, and tighter lending standards mean that some homeowners can't refinance their way out of bad mortgages. Unfortunately, the data shows us that most of the homeowners who are unable to refinance are African Americans and Latinos. Newly released HMDA data from the Federal Reserve shows that African Americans and Latinos were more likely to be denied refinancing than white borrowers. Last year, 61% of refinancing applications from African Americans and 51% from Latinos were denied. Given these studies, it is no surprise that foreclosures are hitting minority neighborhoods very hard. In my capacity as chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Housing and Community Opportunity, I've traveled across the country to view the impact of the foreclosure crisis firsthand. Last year, my subcommittee held a number of hearings. We were in Cleveland, Ohio, as an example, where there was once a vibrant African American neighborhood, or several vibrant African American neighborhoods. They are now ghost towns with block after block of boarded up, vacant, and abandoned houses. A recent study by the Woodstock Institute puts this disproportionate neighborhood impact into perspective. They focused on Chicago, another area that has been hit hard by foreclosures, and found what they found was that foreclosed properties are disproportionately concentrated in minority neighborhoods. In 2008, 35% of foreclosed homes in Chicago, the Chicago area, were in neighborhoods where African American populations were over 80%. They also found that African American neighborhoods have an average 12 vacant and foreclosed homes per 1,000 properties, a rate 2 times greater than the Chicago city average. Their data show that it will take 25% longer for these neighborhoods to recover from the foreclosure crisis than other neighborhoods. What's troubling about the foreclosure rates among minorities and the impact on minority communities is the long-term impacts on minority wealth accumulation. According to a 2008 study by United for Fair Economy, African Americans and Latinos could lose as much as $213 billion in wealth as a direct result of the foreclosure crisis. Wealth building is the difference between sending your kids to college or not. It's the difference between retiring with a comfortable nest egg or relying on Social Security. And it's the difference between starting your own business or working at a low-paying job. Minorities have historically relied primarily on home ownership to build wealth, not stocks or other investments. For example, again, according to a 2007 study by the New America Foundation, 42% of whites own an IRA or KEO compared to only 7% of African Americans and 8% of Latinos. According to a 2006 Federal Reserve study, African Americans and Latinos are 23% and 28%, respectively, less likely than whites to own publicly traded stock. According to one study, home equity makes up 43.3% of all assets for white families, but 62.5% of assets for African American families. Now, that wealth is at risk. Before this crisis, there was already a significant wealth gap between whites and African Americans. For example, in 2004, according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the net worth of African Americans was only 12% that of whites. In 2007, the net worth of African Americans declined even further to 10% of the net worth of whites. Put it another way, for every dollar of wealth accumulated by whites, African Americans have only a dime. Without wealth, without home ownership, without investment, without opportunities, I fear for the state of minority communities. That is why I've been an advocate in Congress for programs and policies that would address the impact of the subprime crisis on all homeowners, including minorities. My visits to neighborhoods in Los Angeles, Cleveland, and other areas with many foreclosures convinced me that Congress had to act to save neighborhoods impacted by the subprime meltdown. I thought that community development block grants may be a good tool for states, cities, and local governments to target resources to low-income communities that are losing population and wealth as a result of rampant foreclosures. That is why I drafted the legislation that Larry just talked about to create the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. The program provides grants to states, localities, and nonprofits for the purchase and rehabilitation of abandoned and foreclosed properties. It has been funded at $6 billion, and it is working. For example, in Los Angeles, NSP funds are rescuing neighborhoods from the impact of foreclosures, and are even being used to provide rental housing for low-income renters, thus solving a citywide affordable renting housing problem. Congress also passed a law to allow homeowners to refinance into fixed-rate mortgages insured by the Federal Housing Administration with a reduced principal amount. This program has not been as successful. It has only had one closing since it began in October 2008 because it requires homeowners to pay high fees, impose also other cumbersome requirements on homeowners and services. However, the program has improved in helping families save their homes at so that more families with underwater loans can take advantage of it. We also passed laws to give services the confidence to modify more loans by protecting them from lawsuits, to keep subprime lenders out of Federal Housing Administration programs, to protect renters in foreclosed properties, and to provide resources to address homelessness. The Obama administration has also attempted to deal with the foreclosure problem by establishing the Making Home Affordable program. The program is designed to address underwater loans by allowing homeowners owing up to 125% of their home's value to refinance unsustainable loans by providing mortgage servicers with a financial incentive to perform loan modifications. Unfortunately, out of the almost 3 million loans that are eligible for the program, only 12% have been modified. And it is worth noting that Bank of America, which received $45 billion from taxpayers, and Wells Fargo, which received $25 billion, have only modified 7% and 11% of their loans respectively. Despite the steps that Congress and the administration have taken, we're really going to have to do much more to help homeowners to save minority neighborhoods. The first step is to make servicers ramp up loan modifications through making home affordable programs. The second step is simply to reform the servicing industry altogether, and I've introduced legislation to do just that. But Congress and the administration must also develop policies that protect minorities and other consumers from predatory loans that create wealth and that lead to reinvestments in minority neighborhoods. These policies are important because if we leave things as they are now, minorities and their neighborhoods will never recover. First, Congress must pass the president must sign into law H.R. 3126, the Consumer Financial Protection Agency Act of 2009, legislation that would create a Consumer Financial Protection Agency and consolidates and creates comprehensive consumer protections. This new agency will completely reshape the way consumer protection occurs and put an end to the products that cause foreclosures and bankruptcies to proliferate. Elizabeth Warren, the chair of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP program, Congressional Oversight Panel, is a leading champion of consumer financial protection, and I'm working closely with her in support of this new agency. This agency would protect consumers from the very exotic and dangerous mortgage products that led to the subprime meltdown. In terms of rulemaking and enforcement, the agency would have wide, sweeping, and broad authority. The agency would be able to issue rules which prohibit abusive or deceptive acts and practices. It would also have all of the necessary tools, such as the ability to hold hearings, issue subpoenas, and file lawsuits to protect consumers. Most importantly, this agency will be able to use all of these tools and abilities to rein in the shadow banking industry. This means the payday lenders and the mortgage services alike will register and be regulated. And there's some here tonight who will probably discuss why CRA should probably be a part of this Consumer Protection Agency. Is that right, Mr. Carr? Final, Financial Services Committee Chairman Barney Frank and others who serve on the committee with me are determined to create this agency. Unfortunately, the banking industry is lobbying hard against this program, and I'm not sure whether our committee will be able to overcome the industry and its lobbyists to get this legislation passed. Second, while financial literacy programs are critical, what minorities really need are opportunities to build wealth. One of the best ways to do this is to foster the development of more minority businesses and financial services professionals. One way to accomplish this is by using government economic recovery programs for capacity building. In implementing economic recovery programs like TARP, or the term asset-backed securities lending facility, Treasury and the Federal Reserve, they have needed to hire outside help. Many of these contracts and the millions in fees they generate have gone to the same bad actors that got us into this financial crisis. My colleagues and I in the Congressional Black Caucus have worked to shine a spotlight on these contracts and to encourage these agencies to include qualified minority firms in their programs. We have identified barriers such as a lack of outreach and knowledge of the abilities of minority-owned firms. We have worked to remove these barriers by holding policy workshops and networking summits. My colleagues and I have done a lot of hard work but there's still more that can be done. We need to create a level playing field so that minority-owned firms have access to the same types and amounts of contracts as larger firms. These firms, such as Williams Capital Group, M.R. Bill, already have the technical and professional skills they need to succeed. They can train and grow a new generation of minority business professionals. What they need is access to the same opportunities that go to the likes of BlackRock, PIMCO, and Goldman Sachs. Third, we need to reinvest in minority neighborhoods. The Neighborhood Stabilization Program is spurring some of this kind of investment, but we should also promote policies to bring profitable businesses, high-quality schools, job training programs, effective public transportation, medical centers, and other essential services to these neighborhoods. For too long, investors have ignored or shunned minority neighborhoods out of a misplaced fear that they can't make any money or they'd have to deal with too many problems. These concerns are unfounded. There are hardworking people in these neighborhoods who need these resources and who, if given the opportunity, would lay these concerns to rest. Investors should learn from the success of African American entrepreneurs such as Magic Johnson, Emmett Smith, and Bob Johnson, who have all realized substantial profits by investing in communities that other investors overlooked. In closing, I'd like to quote the late President John F. Kennedy, who once said of America, quote, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." That statement is as true now as it was then. Minority neighborhoods are the city upon the hill. They need our help now. But if we reinvest, rebuild wealth, and prevent the practices that place these neighborhoods in jeopardy, they will emerge from this crisis stronger and better than they were before. I thank you for inviting me here today and listening to boring statistics. But sometimes it's necessary to reinforce the documentation of what is going on. I thank you so much, and I'm going to stick with you as long as I can if we are going to proceed with some discussion. But I want you to know I'm beginning to feel that I got up at 3 a.m. this morning in Los Angeles and came through Chicago and got to catch a flight out of here to get home about 12 so I could be in Washington at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So let's see how long I can do this, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Waters. You've succeeded in doing at least two things for me, one of which is getting me angrier than I already am about what's going on with the subprime crisis and with race in particular. And the second is you made a very clear and comprehensive, gave us a very clear and comprehensive narrative of what's gone on. I don't know about the rest of you, but we've had students at Milano for a year saying, "Can you please explain what's going on to me?" And you just did it. I mean, don't you all agree? and also made a very good case for what we need to do going forward. My work focuses a lot on financial literacy, the bifurcated financial system, which I think you really laid out, that it's not true that people get the same access to the same systems and the same products, and also the importance of asset building. You know, the fact that even when you control for income, high wealth, high income minority families have much less wealth, often no wealth, and the fact that if they were putting all their eggs in that home ownership basket, that they now have negative wealth, and there's really something we need to do about that. So, we're not done yet. The remainder of the program will include a conversation. First, our moderator will ask the Congresswoman some questions, followed by questions from the audience for her, and we'll then have a respondents panel also followed by a discussion with the audience, and all of this will be moderated by Derek Hamilton. Derek Hamilton is an assistant professor at Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy, an affiliated faculty member in the Economics Department at the New School for Social Research, an affiliate scholar at the Center for American Progress, and a co-associate director of the American Economic Association Summer Research and Minority Scholarship Program. His biography is in your program, so I won't go over everything that he's done, but I will tell you that in terms of why his work is so relevant for what we're talking about tonight, Professor Hamilton's work focuses on the causes and consequences of racial and ethnic inequality and economic and health outcomes. He's published articles on disparities in wealth, home ownership, and labor market outcomes. I have visited and spoken in his class on racial disparities, and it's a fabulous conversation. I urge any of you who are students at the New School to consider taking it in the spring. Dara? Yes. His research has been supported by grants from the Ford Foundation, the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Derek Hamilton to the podium.
So I'm actually going to deviate a little bit from what Lisa said and just start with some opening remarks and then some general questions to all the panelists as well as Ms. Waters. So the panelists, should I have them come up now? If you guys want to come up, you can. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you some more boring statistics also in this little conversation. As many scholars have described, this current recession of the American economy is more aptly described as a depression when considering the economy for Black and Latino Americans. Whether the measure of well-being is employment, poverty, median household income, the typical white household is twice as well off as the typical Black household. Thus, when the American economy is in a recession, Black America is in a depression. Perhaps the most important indicator of well-being, which I did not mention, is wealth. In terms of wealth, the typical Black and Latino household, as Maxine Waters illustrated, holds 10 cents to the dollar of the typical white household. Furthermore, 85% of Black households have wealth holdings below the median white level. Indeed, Black and Latino households would have to save 100% of their income for 3 consecutive years to close the wealth gap. So how do we get here? Counter to the popular discourse, it has not historically been the case, nor is it now the case, that Blacks are more profligate than whites. After accounting for household income, Blacks actually have a slightly higher savings rate than whites. Moreover, as my friend and colleague Sandy Darity has said, the Burnoff-Madoff scandal indicates that even the most affluent are susceptible to forms of financial illiteracy. Most important, careful economic studies actually demonstrate that inheritance, bequest, and intrafamily transfers account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic, socioeconomic indicators, including education, income, and household structure. Indeed, the median wealth of white family whose head has dropped out of high school is higher than the comparable Black family whose head has graduated from college. Why do Blacks have vastly less resources to transfer from one generation to the next? Apart from the national failure to endow Black ex-slaves with the promised 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War, Blacks have been deprived systematically of property, especially land accumulated between 1880 and 1910, by government complicity, fraud, and seizure by white terrorism. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, for example, prosperous Black communities and their associated properties literally were destroyed by white rioters in communities ranging from Wilmington, North Carolina to Tulsa, Oklahoma. The historical use of covenants, of restrictive covenants, redlining, and general housing discrimination, as well as lending discrimination, were also factors that inhibited Blacks from accumulating wealth. And then currently, we're looking at reverse redlining as a factor. Today, we will focus on race and the subprime crisis. Home ownership is the primary source of wealth for most Americans. Moreover, even though whites are considerably more likely than Blacks to own their homes, among Blacks with positive net worth, the share of Black wealth attributable to housing is nearly twice as large as that of whites. Coupled with the fact that Blacks were far more likely to be steered towards subprime loans in discriminatory credit markets, the foreclosure crisis is bound to have a more deleterious effect on Black than white wealth. So I'm going to start by introducing my two panelists, and then I'll go on and give some open-ended questions that they can respond to as they deem. First, we have Jim Carr, and I've had the pleasure of serving Jim Carr. Oh, I had the pleasure. Three panelists. I'm sorry, I didn't meet the third panelist yet. Okay.
And my mic is off too.
Okay. All right. One of us isn't here. All right. Jim Carr is the Chief Operating Officer for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, a nationwide coalition of over 600 local development organizations committed to improving the flow of capital to communities and promoting economic mobility. In addition, he has published several books, scholarly articles, and given testimony in many government and non-governmental hearings. Sarah Ludwig is the co-director of the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project, a New York City-based resource and advocacy center that has worked with over 100 community and consumer groups to promote community economic justice and to eliminate discriminatory economic practices that harm communities and perpetuate inequality and poverty. Then finally, we have Edward Wright, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of City National Bank, the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of International Bank, a minority-owned and managed commercial bank dedicated to building wealth and improving the quality of life within communities it serves. Okay? So the next set of questions are going to be kind of broad and open-ended, and there are about 6 of them, and the panelists can answer them whichever ones they want. The first is, how did we get to this foreclosure crisis and the subprime crisis, right? Congressman Waters alluded to some of the reasons, but we'll see if the panelists can elaborate more. Second, black home ownership peaked in 2004 to a rate of almost 50%. Was there a role for subprime products in achieving these gains? If not, what generated the growth in black home ownership? Third, have we gotten over the hump? Have we seen the worst of the foreclosure crisis, or is there more to come? Fourth, what is the role of fiscal policy in contributing to the foreclosure and subprime crisis? What should be the role of fiscal policy in curbing the crisis? What should be the role of fiscal policy in eliminating the wealth gap in general? Right? And please be as specific as possible when addressing the policies. Fifth, what will be the neighborhood effects, particularly in the New York context, associated with the foreclosure crisis, and is there a role for fiscal policy in addressing these effects? And then finally, what are the implications of credit flow contraction resulting from the foreclosure crisis, particularly for minority borrowers?
Could you repeat? No, I'm just kidding.
The last,
May I start?
please.
Is my microphone on? Well, Representative Waters, she articulated the issue so well that there's not a whole lot that I can say that I had prepared, so I think some of my comments, or most of my comments, are going to be pretty much anecdotal. I work for City National Bank. We are one of 2 minority-owned and operated banks in the metropolitan area, the other one being Carver Federal Savings Bank. We're the 3rd largest minority bank in the United States, the first being United, Bank United up in Boston, the second being Carver, and the 3rd being ourselves. We have a unique history. I don't know if all of you even know that minority-owned banks exist, but we were formed by church members, actually. We had our initiating board of directors go door to door. They went to churches, to congregations. They solicited contributions and investors to buy 10 shares of stock to open a black bank. And this was back in the 70s, and we've been in operation since that time, so that makes us very unique. There are maybe 60 of us in the United States, and the number dwindles each day, and none of us are very large because there just isn't much of a market. We are being squeezed out by a lot of the larger banks, as you can imagine, so there isn't much of a market for us now. But anyway, I think that the 3 essential reasons for the subprime crisis are the global excess of capital that arose when rates went down and it was encouraged to borrow at low rates, And that went on globally. So what happened, it was the global excess of capital and the necessity to invest that capital and get an adequate return, and then to securitize the mortgages, as Representative Waters said. And most importantly, I believe that the largest contributor to this crisis was the relaxation of underwriting standards by lenders. That was absolutely disastrous. Now, City National Bank, being a minority bank, you would think that we might have an entire portfolio of subprime loans that we are dealing with, but that isn't really the case, because we never reduced our underwriting standards. We looked at what was going on over the years with skepticism, and we stayed away from the market. So we do not have a portfolio of subprime residential mortgage loans, and we're very fortunate in that respect. The thing is, anecdotally speaking, I can say that I think what that allowed is that a lot of these subprime borrowers were the least able to afford the American dream. But what happened is they were able to achieve the American dream with the reasons that caused the subprime crisis. If rates hadn't been low, if underwriting standards hadn't been reduced, then they would have been unable to afford the homes that they bought. You can cut me off and ring a bell or something.
Go ahead.
Now, I am a runner, and I'm saying that because I work in Newark and I run in Newark, so I know all the neighborhoods, the good neighborhoods, the bad neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods, and I've been there for 15 years. And when I first started there, where I used to go, the streets used to be full of broken glass. They used to be full of drug addicts, drug pushers, abandoned cars, and abandoned homes. And over the years, as these credit standards relaxed and the subprime crisis started to grow and people borrowed more money, they went in and they bought these homes and they fixed them up. So it became safer for me as I ran through these neighborhoods throughout the year. So even though the subprime crisis is in fact a crisis, it did have some positive aspects to it. And then, as I said, it did enable a lot of these people who could least afford it to achieve the American dream, at least for a while. But then the bubble burst, and of course, as Representative Waters said, there were issues and there were foreclosures. And what happened is the subprime borrowers started to overextend, and then they would roll over their credit card debt into their mortgages. So if you all had credit card debt and you couldn't pay it, you'd simply go to your bank and ask for a home equity loan or a second mortgage loan. They'd add it on to your loan.
No, I mean, I want to respond to some of the things that are being raised and also answer your
Yeah.
questions. Is there something else you
No,
needed
go
to
ahead.
say in
No.
that? Because I think you're covering a lot of ground and raising a lot of issues, which I would respectfully say
Yes.
are actually part of the mythology of the problem. And, but maybe I should have let you keep talking, because it started one way and then it kind of went a different route. But let me just first start by saying what a breath of fresh air was to hear Congresswoman Waters' description and narrative of how we got here, because we still hear repeatedly a very different narrative, which is the one of, I mean, if we each had $1 for every time we heard on the radio or on TV, or I imagine in Washington, someone saying people used their homes like ATMs, people over-leverage, people took advantage of a lax regulatory environment, and so forth, that there, we'd all be, probably not here right now, we'd be out living big in New York City. I needed to finish that sentence, sorry. We had $1 for every time. But I think there is a lot of myths out there, and I'm going to respond to some of the things that you just said and try to be brief, but also answer some of the questions posed with a kind of New York City context, if that works for people. And we use sort of subprime lending generically. It's the title or part of the title of this conference, but it really is a kind of shorthand for a whole array of abusive products and practices and services that have as their common denominator unaffordability, as we heard. So it's not like all of a sudden, after being able to enjoy for a short period of time increased homeownership in communities of color, that things burst. This is actually a problem that has been underway since the advent or growth of subprime lending. Again, I'm going to speak about New York City, starting really in the mid-90s. And we just had this sort of assault on communities that was layered and relentless. So, You know, I find it interesting, and I'm trying to learn about fiscal policy, and I'm trying to learn about sort of global financial forces, and I have a lot to learn about that. But one thing I have to say as a rejoinder to what we're hearing more and more is that there was all this excess capital, is I'm missing a conceptual link between that and the inevitability of pushing subprime and unfit and unaffordable loans on people. Maybe Jim can elucidate this. I know he teaches
certainly will.
courses on finance. So just to kind of round it out, I mean, in New York City, starting in the 90s, we started to see, and here we have, the symbolism of a very large city, and we've got Wall Street here in our midst. So within miles of Wall Street, we had havoc being wreaked as a result of the sort of tail wagging the dog, the engine of securitization needing fuel. And that fuel started with these refinancing loans in the 90s. And just to very quickly give you a summary to pick up on your numbers, but give the New York context, between 1993 and 98, when we started seeing this subprime, what do we want to call it?
Crises.
Crisis, so I was just say, like all the burgeoning in the market, is between 1993 and 1998, HUD found that although about 23% of all refinancing loans in New York City were made in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, 49% of those loans were subprime. If you fast forward into this decade, again, I'm using that, those were literally subprime. I'm going to be, that's in the refinancing market. That's where a lot of these problems were lodged for the first 8 to 9 to 10 years. In more recent history, we started seeing a very aggressive wave of property flipping in New York City and sort of targeting first-time home buyers for the very homes in communities of color where people had refinanced and lost their homes, where there were these layers of foreclosures. I'm going to show a map the next time I talk because I want to not monopolize too much here. But the other piece is that by this decade, in 2004, 2005, looking at home purchase loans in New York City, African-American borrowers were how many times more likely than white borrowers to get a subprime loan? 5, and Latino borrowers 4 times more likely. And in fact, according to our research at NEDAP, looking at the publicly available Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, upper-income African-American women in New York City were more than twice as likely to get a subprime loan than a low-income male borrower. So there's all these sort of contradictions built in here, and I think it's very easy to embrace some of the mythology of it, but the fact is these are forces that were underway for a very long time. The market grew and grew and grew. So when we were looking at the first years of securitization, we were talking about, wow, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. And then you cited figures, Congresswoman, about multi-trillions of dollars in this market before it crashed. And we would say that it wasn't until Wall Street started to feel the effects of this that people started to pay attention. Because communities of color in New York City have been really just decimated by this, and it's something people have been talking about here since 1996, 1997, 1998. We used the words foreclosure and crisis next to each other starting more than 10 years ago.
So let me just interject real quick to tell you how I'm going to manage the time.
I have to respond to excess liquidity.
Right. So we have about 15 minutes. Jim Carr is going to talk, and then I'm going to give the panelists, as well as Congressman Waters, an opportunity to respond to anything that's been said, and then we're going to open it up to audience. So I'm cautioning the panelists to be conscious that we want the audience to participate. Okay.
That means you guys have to talk less, so I can talk more. So let me just start off by saying that I had spoke to the NAACP last year, and I was talking to a friend. I come from Fannie Mae for years and years and years and tend to be a very conservative speaker. And I was talking through this whole subprime nonsense about, the excess liquidity is what happened, and people were buying homes they shouldn't have. And a friend of mine said, "You're sounding like Public Enemy, brother. Don't believe the hype." So I actually wrote a speech called "Don't Believe the Hype," and on the foreclosure crisis, and then it got actually published by Vital Speeches of the Day, but they changed the title to something like "Discrimination, is it still an issue?" I lost something in the translation. At any rate, here's the bottom line. As Congresswoman Waters said so articulately and with lots of power and commitment, This crisis, yes, there was excess liquidity. Yes, there were people who speculated. Yes, it was all this stuff. But the cornerstone of what brought this market down, and the Congresswoman asked the question, why would people make loans they know can't be repaid? Because no one had an interest in them being repaid, because the way the financial system evolved with securitization was that everyone made money all the way up the chain up front, starting with the brokers who used yield spread premiums, which were, as the Congresswoman said, kickbacks. It went to the appraisers who overvalued homes, which helped to inflate the bubble. It went to lenders who failed to underwrite appropriately, who failed to establish escrow, who offered mortgages that Elizabeth Warren, a consumer advocate and the head of the Banking Oversight Panel for Congress, referred to as exploding mortgages, the famous exploding mortgages, which after 2 or 3 years, the interest rates begin to climb by 50 to 60 to 100% or more. It was also the Wall Street bond rating agencies that actually stamped investment grade on bonds that everyone knew was junk. It was not a crisis that was just predictable. It was a crisis that was predicted, going all the way back to the 1990s. In 1999, for example, the nonprofit agencies were working tirelessly to try and get the Federal Reserve and other agencies to prohibit and to use laws that they already had, like the Homeownership Equity Protection Act, which they refused to use. In 1999, the state of North Carolina passed an anti-predatory lending law. At that point, if it never was clear before, it was clear. What was the federal response? To enhance preemption, make it clear that federal law rules in cases where there's a contradiction. Again, it wasn't a crisis that was predictable, it was a crisis that was predicted, and there were thousands of papers on this. The question that Derek also asked, well, was there a role for the subprime market? Well, of course there was, because on average, blacks and Latinos have slightly more credit challenges. But even the measured credit challenges don't mean that they are less eligible or less viable as credit entities. It means that they are less in the market. And so by just engaging less in the market, they're likely to have poor credit scores. Is it likely that once you sort of filter out those who just have reported credit problems versus those who have real credit problems, that there wouldn't be a difference? Yes, there'd still be higher differences because of discrimination. Blacks and Latinos are more likely to be discriminated against. So last hired, first fired. Check out the current recession, 9.8 overall unemployment rate, 15% for blacks, 13% for Latinos. And how about Native Americans? About 23%, a couple of points below that of the Great Depression. So was there a role for subprime? Yes, there was a role for subprime, but there was a big role for prime, 30-year fixed rate. In fact, according to a study by the Wall Street Journal in 2006, over 60% of homeowners in the subprime market had credit scores eligible for prime loans. And in fact, there has never been any credit data study ever released that justifies the extraordinary disparity in subprime loans for African Americans and Latinos. And the idea that subprime loans went to African Americans who were buying homes they couldn't afford is absolute nonsense. They went there because those loans were peddled to those consumers because race was used as a proxy for financial vulnerability. And just like it was said earlier about Bernie Madoff making the point that even the most sophisticated person dealing with a professional financial criminal can get taken to the cleaners, certainly people who have never been in that housing market could be. And so here's a news flash. Many of those consumers, if not the majority of them, could have afforded a fixed rate, 5%, 5.5%, 30-year mortgage without prepayment penalty, without excess fees up front, without second liens, fully documented. All of that nonsense in those loans was directly put in the loans to make them more risky because Wall Street wanted high risk. They paid a premium for high risk, and therein lies the story of the subprime market. And even today, we have failed to pass an anti-predatory lending law. And one of the reasons we need a Consumer Financial Protection Act is that it didn't just happen in home mortgages. It happened in credit cards. It happened in payday loans. It's happened in almost every aspect of the sector. In fact, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has said it better than any community activist I know in terms of what happened. He said, the financial system discovered there was wealth at the bottom of the pyramid, and it did everything it could to make sure it didn't stay there, which is another way of saying, for many firms, financial exploitation became the operative business model, and that is what happened. It wasn't just predictable, it was predicted. Consumer advocates and many members of Congress tried to get laws passed, tried to get the regulators to act. They failed again, they failed miserably, and the crisis we have today is a result of that obvious and patent failure. Now, one other thing real quickly, which was, are we out of the woods? Not at all. And so all the good news on the economy is recovering is producing a statistic which is meaningless in the real world, because what you're hearing even from optimistic economists is jobless recovery. A jobless recovery is meaningless because at the end of the day, the unemployment crisis is now being driven more by unemployment and loss of income. And so while we're coming out of the weeds on the bad products, we're entering the unemployment driven. So if we don't get a control of unemployment, we will have more foreclosures, and guess what? Failure to purge those loans, those predatory subprime loans, allowed the financial institutions to go upscale. And guess what? They brought in a lot of non-Hispanic white households who had higher income and higher credit scores, and they were rolled into these things called pay option arms, which Congresswoman Waters talked about. Well, guess what? Those loans haven't begun to fail in big numbers yet. They are outstanding, and they will begin to trigger en masse next year, roughly about 70% of them. And the average monthly increase in those payments will be $1,000. So even if you, and almost all are upside down, by the way, almost all are being paid on minimum payment. And so even if you see the numbers on foreclosures start to stem and even start to drop slightly month over month, stay tuned. There is more crisis baked into this pie. I'd have a lot more to say, but I'm giving the mic back before I'm so rudely interrupted.
I got you. Okay, so we're going to respond in reverse order this time. And this round, maybe we can limit your remarks to maybe a couple of minutes. Okay, all right.
It's like on TV, they give you 1 minute. Okay. I mean, I think we're leaving out a really big element, which this is a hugely complex set of issues here. We haven't even talked about the sort of legacy of redlining and the historic vacuums that were created in communities of color into which all of these entities, not just the mortgage lenders, but the payday lenders, the rent-to-own stores, the tax refund anticipation lenders, the high-priced credit cards, go down the list, have really just flooded and had, a feeding frenzy for years. So there's much more to say, and I hope everybody who's here, and especially if you're new to this issue, that you understand that this is much more complicated than we can possibly depict here right now. But we really haven't shown a light, although Jim just alluded to it, on the role of the regulators. There's basically an all-out abdication of regulatory responsibility and action during this entire period. So those of us who are policy students in the room, this is really important for all of us, because what we have is, in my view, a system in which, the banks are going to, and the lenders, they've got their own raison d'etre, they've got their own modus operandi, they're going to be out there doing what they do, but what is the role of government if not to rein them in and hold them accountable? And for years, groups like ours, and I see some colleagues here, went to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, we went to the other regulators in New York, and we said, look what's happening in communities of color in New York City. We had maps, I promised I'll show you one. We had documentation, we had case examples, and we were told things like, that's anecdotal. We were told things like, the Community Reinvestment Act doesn't apply to race. It's really only about income. So don't talk to us about meeting community credit needs. We were told things like, aren't you glad that people are getting access to credit? There's been a democratization of credit. Now people who couldn't get access finally can. We were told, that makes no economic sense. Why would somebody make a loan to someone that they can't afford to repay? And the list, I could just sit here for like the next hour, of all the different sort of lines that we were told over and over again. And the banking lobby is back now in Washington, as you can attest 1,000,000 times better than I from my New York perch, really just audaciously, shamelessly fighting all attempts to clean this up and have some meaningful reform. So before you all leave, I hope you will look in your bag and in your pocket, and I was talking about this the other day, but I think it's a good pitch. Take that little piece of metal in your bag or plastic or whatever it's made of, your cell phone, and call your congressperson and tell the person not going to tell you what to say, but it's really important that,
I will.
that you let them know that we care about this Consumer Financial Protection Agency that Congresswoman Waters was talking about, that it would have as its primary mission consumer protection. Many of us would like to see community reinvestment oversight as well. But right now, the regulatory agencies, although they're now saying, we don't need another agency, we're on the case, we would say, it's not your primary mission. In fact, you've got a conflict of interest, and you have shown, sorry, but you're really not up for the task. So that Consumer Financial Protection Agency is central to the Obama administration's financial reform. I would say it's the centerpiece, and we've got to let people know. Our congresspeople in New York City are telling us things like, oh, we're not really hearing from people on this. Please, 202. What is it, 224-3121? But of course, I say that in my capacity as an independent individual, not in my organizational.
Any remarks, Edward?
Yes, I have just one thing to say, that being that there are a lot of programs and a lot of things that are being done and that can be done, but the problems in our minority neighborhoods are not going to improve until the job market improves.
All right, so I'm
Show my
going
map.
to actually open it up to audience. Let's be respectful for our audience who has came and patiently listened through this. So is somebody going to go with a mic?
Is it on? Yeah.
And-
So I just want to thank the panelists for doing such an excellent job, very elegantly explaining some of the origins of a very complex crisis. And I know you just sort of touched upon some of the factors that went into it, and we could probably spend a lot more time going into the complexity of it. What my question relates to, not so much what went wrong in the past and how we can prevent it from happening in the future. Absolutely important question to ask. But right now, the lethargic pace at which loans are being modified. There's a lot of activity in Congress, and Congresswoman Waters mentioned reforming the servicing industry. But I'm wondering what do you see as some of the most critical ways in which we can break the bottleneck in loan modifications, and such that the people who are already stuck in this crisis have a hope of getting out of it?
So the president recently put into place the most comprehensive loan modification program to date. And it's an interesting program because it actually helps to buy down the cost of the mortgage. It shares the cost with the investor, which was not done before. And so that represented a real breath of fresh air. But as Congresswoman Waters pointed out, only 12% of eligible loans since the program has been originated have been modified. And one of the reasons for it is the servicers continue to misbehave. And one of the reasons that the servicers misbehave is that it's not in their financial interest to behave. And so even though the program has a lot of financial incentives, it doesn't have the kind of financial incentives that can come from further exploiting the borrowers by keeping the principal high. If they're receiving a share of the principal balance as part of their fee, why reduce the principal? If they're able to tack on additional frivolous fees the whole time it's in foreclosure, and then they collect their fees when the house is actually foreclosed upon, $1,000 is interesting, but it just doesn't do it in terms of what they can earn. And what's interesting is their interests are actually opposed to both the home buyer and, in many cases, the investor themselves, because loans now going to foreclosure actually are costing 10 times more than the actual loan modification. And so it shows the servicers are a problem. And one of the challenges is that there are lots of incentives, but there are no sticks. And so there need to be sticks. And one of the sticks the president proposed, which was reform of the bankruptcy code, which is really amazing. If you've got a luxury yacht, if you've got investment property, you can go before a bankruptcy judge and they can modify the payments and make it all affordable. But if it's just your home, the home that you own, they can't do that. And so what many people have been trying to do is just get a temporary change in the law to affect the loans that are outstanding, because in fact, it's a national crisis. But unfortunately, it didn't make its way through the Senate. And so there are no sticks. Now, what we have, the National Community Reinvestment Corporation, proposed last year was a homeowners loan corporation, very similar to that of the Great Depression. We believe at this point in the crisis, we're so severely in the crisis, we would need something like eminent domain to actually force those loans to be sold. We don't believe that that's necessarily feasible, that Congress would ever vote for it. But we do know that there needs to be a greater federal role in dealing with foreclosures that produce eviction. In other words, in many cases, when an individual just simply can't afford to pay for the home, then something needs to be done to allow that consumer to stay in the home, because it's the actual eviction process that actually triggers the reduction in the value of the properties. And then a second thing is many people, as I said earlier, are losing their homes as a result of unemployment. And so there should be some type of federal program that might create a moratorium program tied to unemployment benefits, such that while a person is unemployed and looking for work, they're not at the same time being thrown out of their homes, which is a distraction away from looking for a job in an environment that's already challenging enough. I can comment further on the specifics of the Making Home Affordable program, but I'll let others speak. I'll come back if there's time.
Toss it back to the audience. All right, so we had questions in the back. Their hands were, who has the, okay.
I just have a quick question. How is it possible for 99% or so banks to get a CRA rating of satisfactory or better, despite all of these things going on? It just seems to me that that is the failure of CRA.
Did everybody hear the question? Okay.
And then just one comment is, I've done work, and I've discussed it with Sarah different times, showing that the same neighborhoods that were plagued by subprime loans and that were plagued by, or are now plagued by foreclosures, don't have bank branches in them, regardless of income level. Minority neighborhoods, regardless of income level,
Right.
have a far sparser population.
So thank you very
branches.
much. I
Yeah.
planted that question.
Yeah,
Thank you. It's not 98, 99%. That's an exaggeration. It's 97%. And the reason why they get such good ratings is because the law is not being adequately enforced. I mean, it's just as simple as that. There are 10 million unbanked. The Center for Financial Services Innovation estimates 40 million underbanked households in America. We have the greatest foreclosure crisis since the Great Depression. It is so patently obvious that it was disproportionately people of color and no major action at all. The Community Reinvestment Act is not included in the new Consumer Protection Agency, and it needs to be. The argument for not including it is that that new agency is about individual products for individual people. The problem for that is that in communities of color, products haven't been offered on an individual people basis since Plessy v. Ferguson and Separate but Equal. And the reason for that, going back to the 1800s, was to allow for wholesale discrimination, in which you could discriminate against individuals without hurting your own property interests. And so it needs to be included, and the law also needs to be expanded. One last thing. The Community Reinvestment Act, many of you may have heard about it for the first time when it was on TV like Fox News and others as being the fault of the foreclosure crisis. Well, newsflash, according to the Federal Reserve, only 6% of high-cost loans, 6 of those toxic loans, were covered under CRA regulation. So basically about 95% worse. Why? We're not. Why? Because this was a Wall Street problem, not a CRA problem, or alternatively, it was a bank problem of loans that weren't covered under the Community Reinvestment Act, and that's one of the weaknesses in the law. It has lots of loopholes and opt-outs and exceptions that need to be closed, and the law needs to be enforced, and we wouldn't have the crisis we have today.
Let me elaborate on that. I mean, I believe that it's not lack of enforcement of the CRA. It's the CRA, the teeth of the CRA. There are 3 CRA ratings. There's outstanding, there's satisfactory, and there's fail. And you have to do a lot to get an outstanding, but you don't have to do very much at all to get a satisfactory. And as long as you get that, then everything is okay. It's not a problem. So I think that's where we are on that point.
Sarah, did you want to, next question?
Yeah, hi. This is for Congressmember Waters. What sort of bothers me is, we have probably one of the most powerful senators in the Congress from this state, Chuck Schumer, and it doesn't seem like he's being much help on this issue of regulation. And it would seem to me that he would be, probably most of us voted for him, rightfully or wrongfully. Hope he's not in the room. I don't mean it personally, but it would just seem to me that if we were going to do something and try and activate this regulation, it would be to try and impress upon him the importance of it.
Well, I do not want to necessarily reference Chuck Schumer, but I do want to say this. I am constantly amazed that Americans are not angry about what their representatives do or don't do in Washington, D.C. I'm constantly amazed that no matter what the crisis, somehow Americans expect that a miracle is going to happen somehow, that somehow elected officials are going to wake up and one morning and they're going to change their minds, they're going to see the light, and they're going to do better. The fact of the matter is, one piece of homework. Take any elected official and take a look at where their campaign contributions come from. And that'll tell you a lot. That'll tell you a lot. And if there's one thing that I have been totally disgusted about since I've been a member of Congress, and that is the stranglehold that the financial services community have on the Congress of the United States of America. It is profound. It is deep. And just as it was said here, even after this crisis that we're involved in, the audacity of the financial services community to be in Washington, D.C., opposing the Consumer Financial Services Agency that we're trying to put together. They're not ashamed. They don't think that the constituents are going to come after them. They don't care. They only see what they want to see, and that is how do they keep their ability to create more toxic products? How do they keep the ability to keep any of these products from being banned? How do they keep the ability to manage the finances of this country in the way that they want to? And for our minority banks, let me just say this. There's no attention paid to them, despite the fact that we have FIREA, which I'm forever pushing, which I'm in trouble about now. The fact of the matter is, they're only, every time I hear this, systemically important, it just drives me nuts. Because what they're saying is that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 big banks are the only thing that's important systemically in this nation. And that they're the ones who have access to the open window at the Feds. They're the ones who have access to capital. When this gentleman, Mr. Wright, talks about the squeeze that the minority banks find themselves in, it's because they do not have access to capital. I mean, that's really the bottom line. They don't have access to capital, and guess what? Their government does not give a darn. The government is focused on the big boys who walk in and out of the Treasurer's office like they own it. They're systemically important, as they constantly refer to them. And they have not only access to kind of bailout that you saw in TARP, but they can go to the Fed one day and borrow overnight, or however they do it, et cetera, et cetera. They cannot. And that's a fight that I'm fighting very hard. And I want to tell you, it's difficult. It is very difficult. So look at your elected officials. Find out where their money comes from. And go to their offices and say, does this influence your vote? Does this influence what you do or not?
All right. So we have time. I see lots of hands, and I apologize. This is unfortunate. We have time for one more question, and then the panelists will get a chance to make some concluding remarks.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm here as an urban policy student in Milano and as a furious homeowner. So my question is, I believe there's a next chapter to this story. And in the neighborhood that I live in Jersey City, my neighbors and I are being told to short sell our properties because they're underwater. And I'm wondering if this is a phenomenon, because I live in a minority neighborhood. I'm the minority in my neighborhood. I'm wondering if this is a phenomenon that you've heard of and if you think that it's spreading. And I think it's just another avenue that these predators are taking. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is prevalent in areas where you've had severe drops in market values in LA, For example, in areas of Florida where values have plunged 30% and people have lost their jobs, and the value of their homes is much less than the loans that they own on those homes, then the banks, what they're doing is they're approving a payoff of the debt, and far less than the amount of the mortgage, and that's called a short sale. So you do see it happening quite a bit in the areas that are most distressed as far as housing prices.
And I just want to add to that, we had a question before from Solomon, is he still here? About the loan modifications and the logjam there, because it's, anybody who's working on the ground in this field, if you want to change careers and learn how to hit your head against the brick wall, then try to help people with loan modifications. And that was supposed to open up, and that hasn't. But for so many people in New York City, this upside down underwater scenario is what they face. So pretty much any loan modification, unless you really vastly wrote down their mortgage, is not going to be something viable for them. And let me just give you a quick thing to keep in your mind. When people talk about the national foreclosure crisis, I know my mind, although I'm steeped in this stuff, I think about other cities than New York. But in New York, we've got about 33% of the population owning their homes. It's a city of renters mostly, but 33% of 8-point-something million, that's a lot. And when a lot of those people are underwater, you've got tremendous pressures on people's housing. The average amount of a mortgage in default in New York City is around $400,000. So we are talking here about a magnitude, a very sort of anomalous situation vis-a-vis the rest of the country, because a lot of people got into these extremely expensive loans. And again, the people here who work in the field can tell you that day in, day out, they see people who come to them, home health care workers, security guards, people with relatively low wages who were basically induced into getting mortgages for $400,000 and $500,000 and $600,000 for two-bedroom homes, in neighborhoods, particularly, again, communities of color, through property flipping and other intentionally masked products to make the products look affordable. So what do you do for all these people when we've got also, we can't leave these out before we leave tonight, we're in New York City, talking about what housing stock is in question. A lot of these homes are 2 to 4 family homes where the owner lives in the home. So we're talking not just about the owners, we're talking about tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of renters, and a lot of our affordable housing stock in jeopardy as well. So what are we going to do from a policy perspective? We got the morass of loan modifications, but what about all the people who are underwater, who've had all their life savings stripped from them, who have credit scores and credit reports that are going to set them up for the next 10 years with all sorts of troubles in their lives, not just for getting credit, but for getting jobs, for getting rental housing, for getting insurance, and all the spheres into which credit reporting has bled.
Just a real quick.
I've actually been overruled by my Board of Governors and my Dean. We're going to allow one more question, but before that, Jim, you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say, I can't comment on your specific market characteristic because I don't know exactly where or what, but I would just offer you the caution, beware of gifts offering gifts. Beware of strangers offering gifts. If someone's actually offering to buy your home, unless it's a government agency that's actually offering a subsidy, it means no subsidies involved. A private sector person's not stepping up to the door saying, I'm going to take a loss from you in any way. So what they're trying to do is get your home because maybe it's actually in a viable location and they're expecting that when the market recovers, they may be wrong if they don't know the pay option arm numbers. It may turn out to be a good deal, but that's not why they're offering it to you. In all likelihood, if they're soliciting you, then I would be very cautious. You're the second person I've heard tell me that in the last 2 days.
What was the other question?
Last question, really quick.
Oh, you have a response?
Yeah, this is real important, and I'll just say this quickly. A group of the top management of Countrywide, for example, organized a company. It's Penny something. You've probably heard of it,
Yes,
Mr.
I know
Carr.
exactly what you're talking about.
And I understand that they are swooping up these properties for pennies on the dollar.
32 cents on the dollar.
32 cents on the dollar. And at the same time that we can't get these homes modified. But I'm very, very reluctant to tell people to get out. What we need to do is, first of all, for the unemployed, we need a moratorium and we need a write down of the principal. okay, to match what the market really is. In addition to that, we've got to correct some things in loan modifications. Do you know that when they calculate some of these modifications with late fees and lawyer fees, that the modification amount is higher than the mortgage amount that people went in with? So we've got to wipe out and eliminate late fees, lawyers' fees, and all these other junky fees that they put in. And I would advise people, let's work, and our public policymakers, on getting loan modifications that will keep people in these homes, hold on to these homes, because the way the real estate market basically works is it's cyclical. And, you know, just as the speculators expect them to go back up, homeowners should also expect that, you know, these properties and the equity will increase in that. So our job is to get the modifications and the assistance to keep people in their homes, rather than have people give up their homes to speculators, or to keep making more countrywide types rich by buying them up for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, what's interesting about the Countrywide thing was that in the first set of loans that they purchased,
Yes.
they actually purchased, I forget what the exact number was, but between $500 and $700 million worth of loans. They got them at 32 cents on the dollar, and they turned around and offered principal write-downs as well as interest rate write-downs to the owners to keep them in the home. What's interesting is they
do that,
they
that's
actually
good.
wrote down the loans
That's
as
good.
much as 50%, and then turned around and are expecting and projecting that they're going to get 20% returns per year, which shows how viable it is to actually modify the loans, which isn't being done by the servicers. So it's a quirky sort of thing. Well, the unfortunate thing is the people who created the crisis now swoop in and now become very profitable in the process of rebuilding it. And in fact, that's happening all across the board. This year, we're en route to having the greatest set of bank failures in American history. It's just not the big ones, the ones that are considered too big to fail. But what's interesting is the ones that are failing are actually the ones that didn't cause the problem. They're the ones who are feeling the fallout, just like being black or Latino and being in this market. You're feeling the fallout, but you didn't cause the crisis. And in this case, the banks are feeling the fallout. There are things that can be done. There does, however, need to be a much more assertive role of the federal government to actually get the principle down. And how you get that principle down is you force that principle down. You can use eminent domain. There are other policies and laws that can be used. But at this point, we're at such a critical point in the whole crisis with unemployment kicking in that we actually need a new model that addresses that problem. And that one is a lot more difficult because you can't modify unemployment.
Okay. Last question.
Last question, really quickly. First, I just was looking for clarification. I'm not a policy student. I'm wondering, why would Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs take money up front that would later leave them bankrupt? I'm not.
Why they do what?
Why would Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs are benefiting up front and then they're later bankrupt? And you said that it's predicted, not predictable. So I don't understand that. And secondly, you're saying that blacks and Latinos are targeted and they feel it more harshly. But I'm just wondering, I mean, why? I mean, racism is the easy answer. I mean, it is the answer, but what kind of, is this an infrastructural problem? Is this people going one-on-one and just are greeted with someone who's discriminating against them? I just wanted.
Yeah, so let me start with the second question first, because I don't think it was racism per se. I don't think the goal was to exploit people on the basis of their race. I think it was to exploit people on the basis of their financial vulnerability, in which race was used as a proxy for two things. One, your financial vulnerability, and two, the regulators' appetite to actually go in and stop it. They knew this is a market that we can exploit, and they did it.
Would you mention the Wells Fargo lawsuit?
Yeah.
Briefly, Jim.
So Wells Fargo is being sued by the city of Baltimore, and what they found in deposition from some of their top grossing brokers is that it's, you know, I think the share of subprime loans to blacks versus whites in the city of Baltimore was 5 times as much. So like 65% of all loans to African Americans were subprime, compared to something like 13% to non-Hispanic whites. And you probably know these stats as well as I. But in the deposition, they actually found the language that was used to describe these loans was really horrifying, because they found that loans to African Americans were called ghetto loans, and that African Americans were referred to as mud people. So there was a lot of discrimination in that case.
Well,
and
they're
they're
marketing through black churches.
Churches.
Marketing
Yeah.
through black
Churches.
churches. But I do believe that the Wells Fargo was an outlier. For most of it, I think, was just old-fashioned exploitation of a market that was vulnerable and subject to exploitation. The first question you asked, though, could you remind me what that was?
Why would
Why-
they do something if they're going to go
Oh,
bankrupt?
why would they do it? Because they didn't plan to go bankrupt. They had planned. It's called an oops moment. See, there were many oops moments. And one of the oops moments was that in 2006, because you couldn't just keep doing this, in parts of Florida and Arizona and other places, house prices going up 30%, 50% in a year. That just can't be sustained. In 2006, house prices flattened out, and then they started to fall. And instantly, the wheels fell off the process, because the only reason it worked was that house price appreciation guaranteed that, you'd limit a lot of the losses by selling the property. The person would be foreclosed upon, but you'd take their property, you'd sell it again, you'd flip it over and over and over. When the house prices stopped, all of a sudden, the whole game stopped. But these institutions had already been packaging hundreds of billions of product that they had planned to sell, and all of a sudden there was no buyer. So they basically choked on them.
Yeah, but the real question is, why was Lehman Brothers forced to file bankruptcy at the time that it was? Who made that decision, and who was in the room, and does it have to do with competition, and who came out on top?
Read the New Yorker last issue for an answer to that question.
I'm going to elaborate a little more on the question also and say that some would argue the incentive structures for profitability of workers at the bank, managers at the bank, were kind of screwed up in that they were based on short-term returns as opposed to long-term returns. So if you're in quest of short-term returns, then you would engage in these type of products that might have a quicker short-term return. And then the last point is that in addition to the short-term myopic, you end up in a situation where you have to keep inflating the prices so that you stay afloat, which becomes a classic Ponzi scheme type result. And then, so I'm going to give the panelists a last word, but before I do, I want to mention something really quick, and that is we didn't talk a lot about fiscal policy, and fiscal policy has had a role historically. It's well documented by Oliver and Shapiro as well as Ira Katz-Nelson that middle class in America was generated by an asset building process from the federal government, and they largely excluded African Americans from these policies. The last thing I want to mention also is that CFED, an organization, they put forth a study that shows that right now the federal government is engaged in asset building to the tune of about $350 billion. That's a budget that rivals what's spent in the Department of Education. At issue is not that they already spend $350 billion on asset development, it's who benefits from this asset development. The bottom 60% of income earners in the U.S. get about 10% of the proceeds from this asset development policy. A lot of it is in the home ownership tax deduction that people get. So home ownership, we subsidize home ownership, but it's usually the benefits usually go to the top income earners rather than the low income earners. So if we want to engage in policies to address dramatically change so that people who have been excluded from the table can take part in the table, then we need to consider some federal budget, some fiscal policy aimed at asset development, which we could talk about in more detail. However, I'm going to give Sarah the last word.
Looking at the issues of bailouts and systemic risk and too big to fail and the impact on neighborhoods that's been felt throughout the country, you'd think there was this moment to really change things and that there'd be some policy reforms that we could bring about and have a serious, frank conversation about what went down. But like I said, you don't hear the story as told by Congressman Waters sort of everywhere you go, and that's what we all need to be making clear, is that there is a very coherent narrative about how we got here, that it is systemic, and so forth. I would like to ask that we just put up the map, and then people who can stay here can look at it, and in a way, it says everything. Wait, just let me tell you what you're going to see. You're going to see a map of foreclosure actions filed on 1 to 4 family homes in New York City, and there's going to be diagonal lines going over it, and those are neighborhoods that are more than half Black or Latino. And you can tell me if this is a civil rights, economic justice issue, or one just of, haphazard market players. So I want to thank the New School very much for keeping the light shining on this really important issue.
So So let me just thank Derek. Congressman Waters had to leave. The panelists. I'm tempted to almost say we should just order in for pizza or something and keep talking about this. But let me just, hear from you. Would you guys like to continue this conversation another time? I just thought this was an amazing conversation, and I think it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of the issue. So join me, please, in thanking everyone who helped make tonight possible.